Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, I welcome Brenna Roth, a physician, onto the show to talk about her public service loan forgiveness journey, where she recently had more than $550,000 of loans forgiven tax-free. Yes, you heard that right. More than $550,000 of student loans forgiven tax-free. We talk about how she accumulated that large debt load, her feelings toward the debt, what went as planned and didn't go as planned along the way, and advice that she has for those that are facing high student loan debt. Let's hear from today's sponsor, First Horizon, and then we'll jump into my interview with Brenna Roth. Does saving 20% for a down payment on a home feel like an uphill battle? It's no secret that pharmacists have a lot of competing financial priorities, including high student loan debt, meaning that saving 20% for a down payment on a home may take years. We've been on a hunt for a solution for pharmacists that are ready to purchase a home loan with a lower down payment and are happy to have found that option with First Horizon. First Horizon offers a professional home loan option, aka doctor or pharmacist home loan, that requires a 3% down payment for a single family home or townhome for first-time home buyers, has no PMI, and offers a 30-year fixed rate mortgage on home loans up to $726,200. The pharmacist home loan is available in all states except Alaska and Hawaii and can be used to purchase condos as well. However, rates may be higher and a condo review has to be completed. To check out the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to start the pre-approval process, visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Brenna, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Well, it's been a while since we have shared some PSLF stories on the podcast. In fact, over a year and a half ago on episode 248, we featured 3 pharmacists that collectively had more than $700,000 of student loans forgiven. We'll link to that episode in the show notes. But all that to say, it's been a while, and I'm certainly excited for this conversation, which came to be after YFP Planning financial planner Kim Bolton shared the good news with our team about your Mohila account officially showing a $0 balance with over $550,000 that was forgiven tax-free. And as soon as I heard that, I thought we have to share this story with our community. Brenna, as I mentioned to you before we hit record, there still is a lot of skepticism, a lot of questions, a lot of unknowns surrounding public service loan forgiveness. And I think the more stories that we can share, the more information that we can get out, the better. So before we dig into your specific journey, tell us a little bit about your background, including your journey into medicine, where you went to school, and the work that you've been doing since.
Yeah. So I'm a trained infectious disease doctor. I did my undergraduate work at Tulane University. I also got a master's of public health there. And then I worked for a couple years in public health work, research, and then I went on to medical school at Ross University. And I did my residency at York Hospital in Pennsylvania, and I did my infectious disease fellowship at the University of Maryland. And I've been working since then.
a lot of years of training. Certainly our audience can appreciate that. You know, $550,000 of debt that's forgiven tax-free, that's a big number. And I think even quite shocking to our community who's used to high debt loads, but not that high, right? Maybe $150,000, $200,000, $250,000, but over $550,000. Again, that is a large amount. And I assume, and one of my questions here, Brenna, as we get started is, how did that debt load come to be as big as it was? You know, is that a function of medical school as well as the master's degree? Tell us a little bit more about the accumulation phase of that amount of debt.
Yeah. So it's from the loans that I took out for my master's of public health as well as medical school. And I was paying off the master's of public health initially when I left school, but then when I started in medical school, that repayment was paused, but during that time, still the loans were collecting interest. Mm-hmm. So it was really that accumulation over all those years of the loans plus, and I'm sure people are familiar, they have rather high interest rates. Mm-hmm. So, and I was no exception. So, just those high interest rates building up over years really impacted the amount.
Yeah, the accumulation of interest, on a couple $100,000 or more of debt adds up pretty quickly, especially over periods of time with training involved. And I think that while most people know that, we have somewhat, Brenna, forgotten that just because of the last 3 years we've been on this freeze. And so I think for those of us that graduated, many of my loans were at a fixed 6.8% interest on the federal side. And you quickly realize like, whoa, when you've got a couple $100,000 of debt, if you're not making payments that are covering that interest, that loan balance grows pretty quickly. And all of a sudden 200 becomes 250, becomes 300. Now, if we're pursuing public service loan forgiveness and we get to the finish line of tax-free forgiveness, that's not a bad thing. The goal is that we pay as minimum out of pocket as we can to have as much as we possibly can forgiven tax-free. But obviously for those that go through the journey of paying those out of pocket, not through a forgiveness plan, certainly that can be a concern. Brenna, I'm curious about your feelings surrounding the debt. No right or wrong answer, but I often talk with pharmacists. I joke it's the student loan debt pain scale. 0 to 10. I talk with some pharmacists that may have a couple $100,000 of debt, and they describe it as a 10. Right, the house is on fire. It's causing anxiety. They're frustrated. They're worried, and even something like a PSLF strategy, they want these gone tomorrow. Right, even though the math shows it's going to be favorable, it's causing that much stress. Other end of the spectrum, I'll talk with pharmacists say I'm closer to a 1 or a 2 or a 3. Like I recognize it's a big deal, but they kind of are what they are. And, if it's a longer payoff or a forgiveness strategy, they may be more comfortable with that to be able to maximize whatever they can dollars wise. So for you and your journey, what were your feelings surrounding the debt load? And did that change at all as you were going through this PSLF journey?
It definitely changed over time. I mean, I would say it was at a 10 at points. But honestly, I got to a point where at one point before I started into PSLF, I really just thought I will just have these debts forever and it's just going to be a part of my life and better to just accept it and know that it's just going to be there. So I would say it went from a 10 to maybe more like a 5 or 6, because I won't say that I wasn't at all concerned, but it kind of diminished. But with PSLF, I think initially I won't say it decreased because I was a little skeptical about whether it was the best choice. Yeah. And I over time I switched the companies that were handling my loans. Yeah. And that never proved to be a really great transition. So that was always stressful because I was always worried that documentation or information would be lost and the efforts I'd been putting in would not show up at the end, like something would go wrong. And so there were moments where stress kind of went up about all of it. But I would say overall, maybe it was only the last probably few years that it dropped below a 5 for me. Yeah. When I started to have more confidence that things were really moving and things were really going to actually be forgiven. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up with the loan servicing companies, right? That's something we hear often, which is those can be headaches to navigate. I mean, even right now with the new SAVE plan that's coming out, people's payments are being calculated incorrectly, for good reasons. People are freaking out, wanting to get the right information, might have to recertify income. Should I recertify income right now? I mean, there's just so many nuances and wrinkles. And I think as you go through some of the pain of those and you get over those speed bumps, you tend to get a little bit more comfortable knowing how to navigate it. But unfortunately, the difficulties with the loan servicing companies, that hasn't gotten a whole lot better. I think people have gotten more comfortable with PSLF because of hearing stories like yours, or getting more education and information to make sure that they're crossing the T's and dotting the I's correctly. But we would be lying if we said it's going to be a clean journey for everyone, right? Just 10 years, 120 payments, you wake up, it's tax-free. That's the goal. But it doesn't mean there's not going to be some bumps along the way as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
You mentioned reluctancy. I want to talk more about that. Is that something we hear a lot? I often will present on student loans. And when I show the calculations, I think, people nerd out and they get really excited about, I can optimize this. And, maybe it allows me to achieve other financial goals because I'm not having to put as much towards my student loans. But there still is very much a sense and feeling of what if, right? What if the rules change? What if, this isn't everything that I think it's going to be? And so I want you to talk a little bit more about your reluctancy. What were some of those questions? And then what ultimately changed that allowed you to say, okay, yes, this is the path that I'm going to pursue?
So it should be noted that I was first presented really seriously shortly after signing up with Tim with YFP. And because my loans were probably my major financial concern at the time. And so this was 2016, 2017, and I'd heard about the program, but I hadn't really heard of anybody successfully navigating it for sure. And so I think it was just not really knowing. My hesitancy was not knowing for sure if after all of those years, things would actually be forgiven. And of course, as you mentioned, the strategy really is to lower your payments as much as possible and to get through those 10 years meeting the requirements, but taking as little financial hit as possible. And which the alternative to that would be, okay, let's focus on paying off as much as we can each month and getting this paid down as quickly as possible. So you're accumulating as little interest. So those are like the two options that were presented to me. And while it was clear that PSLF made the most sense on paper, my reluctance came from not being totally sure that at the end of that 10 years, and that would be 10 years wasted in accumulating interest and, all of these things. And I just, that was really where my hesitancy came from. And again, this was a number of years ago when there wasn't as much evidence that the program was really going to definitively work. And I didn't know if I even had the concern of what if they just up and decide to cancel it for some reason. So it was really that. And you did hear horror stories of people thinking that they were doing everything right for years and then getting 9 years in and being told, oh, no, you were in the wrong repayment plan or whatever it may be. And during one of my switches I was checking in with my loan servicer and just to see, is everything on track? Does everything look okay? And I felt pretty comfortable because you guys were helping me. So I felt like I's were dotted, T's were crossed, but I was still checking in. And they actually told me, oh, we don't go back and check that stuff until it's like the last year of repayment. And suddenly I realized, oh, that's why people get to the end.
Yes.
And they don't know because nobody's really reaching out and communicating with them that this isn't correct or this should be. And so people were getting really far along before getting any feedback that anything was not correct. So
yeah. And when you mentioned the skepticism for good reason, that was around 2017. Is that correct?
Yeah. 2016 or 17, somewhere in there. Yeah.
Which totally makes sense, right? This program was legislatively enacted in 2007, 10-year timeline to forgiveness. That first group to be forgiven would have been 2017, 2018. And this is where a lot of the initial negative press came out. And to be fair, this, Department of Ed could have done a lot better job in terms of, communicating this and preventing some of these problems that people were identifying to your point, at the end, right? When they're getting near the finish line. And even in the 6-7 years since then, the information has gotten a lot better. The education has gotten a lot better. I think the loan servicers are more comfortable, still not necessarily easy to always work with, more comfortable. And the path, even with employers, now there's through the studentaid.gov profile, you can punch in the EIN of your employer and see if they're a qualifying employer. I mean, even those questions in the past were like, am I 100% sure that I'm working for a qualifying employer? So for good reason, you had skepticism. And, when you talk about the horror stories, I mentioned to you before we hit record that there was an article published by NPR, I think it was 2018, 2019, that the headline was 99% of PSLF applicants are denied. And, it was somewhat of a misleading story when you actually looked into the details in terms of the number of people who didn't fully complete their application and the paperwork. But there were fair issues. And those issues being, oh, I didn't realize that I had to maybe first consolidate my loan into a direct loan to be able to then unlock a qualifying repayment plan so that then it counted as a qualifying payment. And it's even crazy when I present on this topic, Brenna, like I even catch myself like well, if you do this and then you do this and then you do this, then it counts as a green check mark, right? Then we're good. And it's kind of crazy that we have to jump through all these hoops, but that's just the system that we're in and the cards that were been dealt. Now, thankfully, you were positively impacted by some of the changes that the Biden administration implemented, where for individuals that maybe didn't have all those T's or I's crossed because they didn't necessarily know from Jump Street that they were going down a PSLF pathway, that there was a reconciliation process for those payments to count as qualifying payments, which you benefited from. Is that correct?
Yeah, because when I consolidated and got everything in order, and that was actually another thing I didn't realize, because you mentioned employment and the employers that count. I really did not think that my residency training would count, and it was actually, again, Tim who pointed out that he really thought it would. And so that was another thing that pushed me. Once I realized that that period of time also counted, that shifted, I think, my willingness to go into PSLF. But yeah, I did benefit because I did have some of my loans were in the correct repayment plan, but I had some that were not. So there was a gap of, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years between some of the loans, just because once I got those into the correct repayment plan, it started from zero. So it didn't matter that I'd been paying those loans for years. None of those previous payments had counted because they weren't in the correct repayment plan. So, but luckily with that Biden, that like 1 year going back and counting, a lot of those payments that hadn't previously counted towards the forgiveness were counted, which was great. So.
Yeah, and I think that was really helpful, especially for people, Brenna, like you, that maybe necessarily didn't start with the PSLF journey in mind. We are seeing more people now that they come out, they go into residency, they know, okay, I'm not going to defer, so I can count those as qualifying payments. And they're thinking about PSLF as a strategy right away. But that hasn't always been the case, again, just based on the age of the program and the information that we have available. One of the things that is beneficial about this strategy, as you've mentioned, as I've mentioned, is to try to pay as little out of pocket so that we can have as much forgiven tax-free. And you mentioned before we hit record that you were able to have about 5 years, about half of the 10-year timeline of payments, actually where you weren't having to make payments at all. Tell us more about what was happening where you were able to have such a large chunk of time where you didn't have to make those payments.
Yeah. So everybody has been affected by the pause in payments with COVID. And so I was also affected by that. But I moved to Tanzania actually in 2017. So, and I was living there full time. So because of that, it affected my taxes and basically what my income looked like, and thus my repayment. So if I remember correctly, there were a couple years there where technically I could have been paying zero. I was still paying a small amount on my loans, but yeah, I had a couple years there where just because of living internationally and working internationally, my income appeared low enough that because it's income based. And so basically my payment was functionally zero.
So yeah, you had a few years of the pandemic freeze, as did other borrowers, where those counted as qualifying payments. That was one of the big questions when that freeze started, and that was good news that people that were pursuing PSLF, those counted as qualifying payments to the freeze. That just ended here in September of 2023, and then you had the couple years in Tanzania. You mentioned perhaps those could have been $0 payments. You were making small payments, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the most common questions that I get is, should I defer my loans during, residency, or in your case, residency and fellowship? And while not blanket advice, generally my answer is you don't want to defer. And the reason you don't want to defer is that typically because you're earning such a low income while you're in residency or fellowship relative to what you will earn, and how they do the calculations on these, often these will be very low and sometimes $0 monthly payments. But as long as you're in active repayment, those count towards qualifying payments of the 120. So I still think there's a lot of advice out there from maybe my generation of pharmacists or those even older. I graduated in 2008, where it was kind of blanket advice, like defer in residency. And often the case may be actually not to defer, so you can get those to count as qualifying payments.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because you just triggered, I think that's actually because I still had that feeling of what if something goes wrong with the PSLF. So even though I was being told those couple of years, you don't have to make a payment, it's zero, it will still count. I made the decision to make a small payment because I didn't want anybody to be able to come back later and say, oh, you weren't paying during these times.
Yeah.
So I still had my own little,
okay.
is this really going to work the way it's supposed to work, even at that point? And yeah, so, but definitely it makes sense to, if you're going to do PSLF, to pay during residency, fellowship, those kind of years when you're not making very much money.
Yeah. And one of the other, we won't spend much time on this now, we'll talk about it in another episode, but one of the advantages of the new SAVE plan that was announced by the Biden administration here in the last couple of months, and certainly it's not the right fit for everyone, but especially those that are new graduates, new trainees in residency, there's a provision as a part of that SAVE plan where as long as you're making the minimum payment, whatever that is based on your income, that your loan balance can't grow, which is really nice because, if you're in deferment, like interest can still accumulate. You're not making any payment technically. And so, especially for those that are in 1 or 2 or more years of residency, that can be really valuable. Brenna, what did PSLF allow you to do in terms of other goals, right? So typically if we're optimizing this strategy, we're hopefully paying less out of pocket than we normally would have with other strategies. And therefore that gives us options to invest and save or pursue other financial goals where we don't have to just solely focus on our student loans. So for your situation, for your financial plan, what did PSLF allow you to do in terms of other goals?
I really, for the most part, focus a little bit more on investment, retirement, and because really I hadn't been too focused on that until I was finishing a fellowship, going into an actual job and feeling like I had that money. So I think that allowed me to focus a little bit. Because as I said, I sort of always thought that these loans would just be part of my life. And so it kind of, I think, shifted my long-term thinking. And as we discussed before, having the loans forgiven didn't really change my day-to-day, but even during that process, I think instead of being so focused on I'm going to have to repay this at some point, I could really focus on that longer term. Where do I want to invest my money? And I mean, yes, it did allow, because I think I would have been far more reluctant to maybe take this trip or that trip for fear of what that meant longer term. And so it probably did allow me to feel a little more free to do those kind of things. But for me, it was really more about the longer term goals and being able to focus more on investments and retirement plans and those kind of things.
And that's one of the things I love about this strategy is when we're optimizing this, one of the goals we're trying to achieve is to lower our adjusted gross income the best that we can, which is the factor they're using in the payment calculation to determine what your monthly payment is. And one of the ways we can do that, kind of the low-hanging fruit, is making sure we're maxing out, traditional retirement accounts like a 401k, a 403b, maxing out HSAs. And so there's this beautiful double effect of not only are we then saving more through those vehicles, which are going to be able to grow and compound in time value of money, make sure we start that as early as we possibly can, but it's also at the same time lowering our monthly student loan payment. And that's really cool. Like when we can see that working, and we all know, our listeners know well, that when you're saving even just a little bit more early in your career, and that money has a long time period to grow, that's going to have a significant impact and effect. Brenna, I'm curious, we have a group of graduates coming out right now that many may be listening to the show. We have 3 graduating classes now that haven't had to make any payments on student loans because of the freeze. Interest just started back up in September. Payments are resuming here next month in October. And I think it's fair to say there's a decent amount of anxiety, maybe people that were making payments that didn't have to, and now they're having to make payments again. Or for new graduates, they're just on the front end of this journey and, not really sure what is ahead, but certainly there's some anxiety surrounding that. As you look backwards now, finish line has been crossed. You've had a large amount of debt forgiven tax-free. What advice would you have, whether it's, pharmacy graduates, medical school graduates that are just getting started and they're looking ahead and saying, this feels big, this feels scary?
I think I would say definitely give PSLF some serious consideration. I won't say it's the right thing for everybody. Obviously, it can depend on how much debt do you have and what kind of job are you going into, how much are you going to be making. I'm in infectious diseases in medicine. That's not a subspecialty that is known to make a lot of money compared to some others. So, for other, and I don't know as much about pharmacists and their training and different specialties within that, but I would assume there's some variation as well. So I think it is a very individual decision. And for me, though, as I said, having a financial planner, being able to discuss it, really just my income to debt ratio, PSLF was just very clearly the best option for me. So I think just really give it some serious consideration and don't talk yourself out of it immediately. And it is working. And just my experience over many years and with many different, having my loans switched from different companies, I can tell you it's been so much easier recently to be able to track things, to get information about things. It's gotten so much easier over the years. And I mean, it does work. There's more and more people with loans being forgiven. And so I hope that the concern and the fears are diminishing over time. But, I won't say everybody needs to go out and do it, but I think it should be definitely a serious consideration as an option.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. We estimate in pharmacy, and I know it's higher in medicine, just based on distribution of practice and where people are at, nonprofit to for-profit. But we estimate that about 25 to 30% of all pharmacy graduates are eligible or qualify for PSLF. Now, they may not have the right debt to income ratio. It may not make sense. They may be unsure about how long they're going to be in the nonprofit space, and there's other questions. But to your point, Brenna, I think the take-home point I hear there is making sure that you're considering it among all of the options and, running the numbers. How do we feel about it? What does this mean for other parts of the financial plan? And making sure that we feel that we're making an informed decision, looking at all the different options that we have on the table. For some, that's PSLF. For some, that could be a non-PSLF strategy over a long period of time if they're working for a for-profit. Or we have some individuals that say, hey, I really want to aggressively pay these off, and they have reasons and a rationale that may make sense for them. So, this is certainly an area where whether we like it or not, student loan repayment is a somewhat complicated topic, and it's something that we've really got to dig in and make sure that we've got good information as we look at and evaluate all the options that are available. Well, Brenna, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time coming on the show to share your journey of having over $550,000 of debt that was forgiven tax-free. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to share some other resources in the show notes of where we've talked about public service loan forgiveness as well. And to the Department of Ed's credit, as you gave them credit here, I think recently, of information getting better in the loan servicing companies, they have updated a lot of information and resources. And especially with so much changing right now, make sure to check that out at studentaid.gov. So again, Brenna, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you.
Before we wrap up today's show, I want to again thank this week's sponsor of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast, First Horizon. We're glad to have found a solution for pharmacists that are unable to save 20% for a down payment on a home. A lot of pharmacists and the YFP community have taken advantage of First Horizon's pharmacist home loan, which requires a 3% down payment for a single-family home or townhome for first-time home buyers and has no PMI on a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. To learn more about the requirements for First Horizon's pharmacist home loan and to get started with the pre-approval process, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. Again, that's yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home-loan. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.